The sunset painted the sky crimson as Grady Steele stared at the headstone, his calloused fingers tracing the freshly carved name of his wife, Elizabeth. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass of Wyoming Territory, 1878, but it couldn't drown out the hollow ache in his chest or the cries of his two young children waiting in the wagon behind him. "Pa, I'm hungry," 7-year-old Jonah called out, his small voice cracking with the grief neither of them knew how to express. "Me too," 5-year-old Sarah added, clutching her rag doll with dirt-streaked fingers. Grady turned from the grave, his jaw set hard against emotions he refused to acknowledge. "We'll be home soon," he said flatly, climbing onto the wagon seat. The children had already learned not to ask about their mother, not to mention how she died bringing their baby brother into the world, only for the infant to follow her 3 days later. As they approached their homestead outside Hecla, Wyoming, Grady stared at the cabin he and Elizabeth had built together 5 years ago when they'd first arrived from Missouri with dreams of cattle and prosperity. Now it was just a wooden box holding memories he couldn't bear to face. That night, as the children silently ate the beans he'd warmed over the fire, Grady caught Sarah with her head bowed and hands clasped. "What are you doing?" he asked sharply. "Saying grace like Mama taught us," she whispered, eyes wide with uncertainty. "There'll be none of that anymore," he said, pushing his plate away. "Just eat your food." 3 months passed with Grady growing more distant. His cattle ranch, once his pride, received only the minimal attention required for survival. His children lived like shadows in their own home, learning to stay quiet and expect little. On Sundays, when the church bell rang in Hecla, Grady would work harder, louder, drowning out its call with the pounding of fence posts or the splitting of wood. "Mr. Steele," Sheriff Parker called one afternoon as Grady loaded supplies at the general store. "Haven't seen you at service since, got no business there." Grady cut him off, tightening the ropes on his wagon. Preacher Jensen was asking, "Tell him to save his breath." Grady interrupted again. "God and I have nothing to say to each other." The sheriff sighed. "That's not what I wanted to talk about anyway." New schoolteachers arrived from Boston. Town councils asking all families with children to come meet her tomorrow. "My children don't need schooling yet, Grady," the sheriff said firmly. "Those kids need more than you're giving them." Elizabeth would, "Don't you dare tell me what she would want," Grady hissed, his eyes flashing. "I know exactly what she wanted to live. To see her children grow up. To meet her son." His voice cracked on the last word. "But God had other plans, didn't he? So spare me your sermons and your schoolteachers." With that, he climbed onto his wagon and snapped the reins, leaving the sheriff standing in the dusty street. That evening, a knock at the door startled the silent household. Sarah peered through the window and gasped. "Pa, there's a lady outside." Grady opened the door to find a slender woman with auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a simple bonnet. She wore a travel-worn but respectable blue dress and carried a small carpet bag. "Mr. Steele?" she asked, her voice gentle but confident. "I'm Tabitha Allen, the new teacher in Hecla. Sheriff Parker mentioned you weren't able to attend the meeting today, so I thought I'd introduce myself properly." Her green eyes met his squarely, showing no intimidation at his imposing stance. "No need, Miss Allen. My children won't be attending your school." Behind him, he heard Sarah's disappointed intake of breath. Tabitha smiled patiently. "I understand your reluctance, Mr. Steele, but perhaps you'd allow me to explain the curriculum I've developed? I believe strongly that education is especially vital in frontier communities. We're doing fine on our own." She glanced past him to where Jonah and Sarah stood wide-eyed in the shadows. "Your children are lovely. Would you mind if I at least said hello to them? I've brought a small gift for each child in the district." Before Grady could refuse, Sarah had darted forward. "Are you really a teacher, madam?" Tabitha knelt to the child's level, ignoring the dirt on her dress and the tangles in her uncombed hair. "I certainly am. And what's your name?" "Sarah Elizabeth Steele. I'm 5.5. What a beautiful name. And is that your brother?" Jonah approached cautiously. "I'm Jonah. I'm 7. Tabitha reached into her bag and pulled out 2 small books. "These are for you. Stories about children your age having adventures." The children accepted the gifts with reverence, touching the colorful covers as if they might vanish. "Do you know how to read?" Tabitha asked gently. Sarah shook her head, but Jonah nodded. "Ma taught me some before." Grady cleared his throat harshly. It's getting late, Miss Allen. Tabitha stood, brushing dust from her skirt. Of course. The journey out here took longer than expected. She turned to leave, but paused. Mr. Steele, my classes begin next Monday in the church building. All children are welcome, regardless of their family's circumstances. We aren't churchgoers, he said flatly. The schoolhouse hasn't been completed yet, so we're using what space is available. The learning is secular, I assure you. Her eyes softened. Children need more than just physical sustenance, Mr. Steele. They need to feed their minds too. After she left, the children clutched their books through supper, barely eating as they examined every page. Can we go to school, Pa? Please, Sarah begged. We'll see, he muttered, though he had no intention of sending them. The next morning, Grady rode out early to check on a broken fence line in the north pasture. Returning at midday, he was surprised to find the cabin empty. Panic seized him until he spotted a note on the table in careful handwriting. Mr. Steele, I've taken the liberty of bringing your children to town to assess their educational levels. We will return by supper. Respectfully, T. Allen. Fury replaced his fear. The audacity of this woman to take his children without permission. He saddled his horse again and galloped toward town, dust billowing behind him. He found them in the church, Jonah at a small desk laboriously copying letters while Sarah sat beside Tabitha, listening to a story. 3 other children from neighboring farms were scattered about the room. Mr. Steele, Tabitha said calmly when she spotted him in the doorway. Your son has remarkable aptitude for mathematics. You had no right, he growled, low enough that only she could hear. No right to take my children. Perhaps not, she acknowledged, rising to meet him. But they have rights too, Mr. Steele. The right to learn, to grow, to connect with others. They're my responsibility. Yes, she agreed. And what will you have them become? Half-wild creatures who can't read or cipher, who don't know anything beyond your property line. His hands clenched. You know nothing about us or what we've been through. Her expression softened. I know loss when I see it, Mr. Steele, in your eyes and in theirs. Something in her tone made him pause. She wasn't looking at him with the pity he'd grown to despise from townspeople. Instead, there was understanding, as if she recognized the landscape of grief from her own travels through it. Pa, Sarah had noticed him. Miss Allen says I'm smart. She taught me division already, Jonah added, holding up a slate with neat chalk numbers. Grady felt the fight drained from him, replaced by weariness. Get your things. We're going home. Mr. Steele, Tabitha said, I apologize for overstepping, but please consider allowing them to attend regularly. 3 days a week would make a significant difference. He looked at his children's hopeful faces and felt something crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Monday. They can come Monday. I'll bring them myself. The relief and joy on their faces twisted something in his chest. That Sunday, Grady deliberately worked through the sound of church bells, though he noticed his children watching the distant steeple from the porch. Monday morning, he grudgingly hitched the wagon and drove them to town, ignoring their excited chatter. I'll collect them at 3, he told Tabitha shortly, not meeting her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Steele, she replied, and he caught a note of genuine gratitude in her voice. 3 days a week, he brought them to school, using the hours to conduct business in town or work the closer sections of his property. Despite himself, he noticed changes in his children. They talked more, asked questions, sang little songs Tabitha had taught them. Sarah's hair was neatly braided each afternoon when he collected her, and Jonah carried himself with newfound confidence. One rainy Thursday when they couldn't attend, Jonah spent the morning teaching Sarah letters at the kitchen table, showing more patience than Grady had seen in him since Elizabeth died. Miss Allen says everyone can learn if you explain it the right way, Jonah told him seriously. That evening, Sheriff Parker rode out to the ranch with news that made Grady's stomach clench. Miss Allen's cottage has a bad leak. Rain's coming through the roof, something terrible. Preacher Jensen offered her a room, but she's reluctant to impose. What's this got to do with me? Grady asked, though he already suspected. You've got that extra room, and she's doing right by your kids. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Town council would consider it a personal favor if you'd offer her lodging until repairs can be made. Week or 2 at most. Have her stay with the Wilsons. They've got daughters. Wilson's place flooded last spring, remember? They're all crammed into 2 rooms at her brother's homestead. Grady rubbed his beard, thinking of his children's pleading faces if he refused. Fine, but temporary only. The next day, Tabitha arrived with a single trunk and her carpet bag. Sarah greeted her with unrestrained joy, while Jonah showed uncharacteristic shyness. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Steele," Tabitha said as he carried her trunk into Elizabeth's sewing room, now stripped of everything personal. "I promise I won't disrupt your household." "My children seem fond of you," he said stiffly. "It's for their sake." That evening, as Grady served the simple stew he'd prepared, Sarah automatically folded her hands and bowed her head. He was about to reprimand her when Tabitha gently interrupted. "In my family," she said conversationally, "we each shared something we were grateful for before eating. Would you mind if I continued that practice?" Before he could object, Sarah exclaimed, "I'm grateful Miss Allen is staying with us." Jonah, after a cautious glance at his father, added, "I'm grateful for the new book about explorers." Tabitha smiled warmly at them. "I'm grateful for your hospitality and this delicious-smelling stew." 3 sets of eyes turned expectantly to Grady. "I don't participate in such things," he said flatly. "That's all right," Tabitha replied without judgment. "Perhaps another time." The conversation shifted as the children eagerly told Tabitha about the farm and their chores. Grady remained silent, but found himself watching her interactions with his children. She listened attentively to their ramblings, asked thoughtful questions, and laughed at their small jokes. When Sarah spilled her milk, Tabitha helped clean it without scolding, turning it into a lesson on absorption and evaporation that had the girl giggling. Later, after the children were in bed, Grady found Tabitha sitting on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. "They should be asleep by now," he said. "I read them a story. I hope that was all right." He nodded curtly, then hesitated before sitting on the opposite end of the bench. The night was clear after the rain, stars pricking the vast Wyoming sky. "You're good with them," he admitted reluctantly. "They're wonderful children. You should be proud. Their mother deserves the credit." Tabitha was quiet for a moment. "May I ask about her?" "The children mention her sometimes, but they're careful not to when you're near." Grady stiffened. "There's nothing to tell. She died in childbirth 8 months ago. The baby followed." "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "That's an unbearable loss." "What would you know about it?" he snapped, immediately regretting his harshness. Instead of taking offense, she gazed out at the stars. "My husband and daughter died of typhoid 3 years ago. Emmett was 32. Clara was 4. The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, struck him speechless. "That's why I became a teacher," she continued. "I needed purpose. A way to honor Clara's memory by helping other children." "I didn't know," he said finally. "How could you?" She offered a small smile. "We all carry our burdens privately, Mr. Steele, but they're easier to bear when shared." "Grady," he corrected quietly. "My name is Grady." The next morning, Grady woke to the unfamiliar sound of laughter in the kitchen. He found Tabitha teaching the children to make Jonah cakes, flour dusting Sarah's nose, and Jonah proudly flipping one in the pan. "Pa, Miss Allen says these are what the Pilgrims ate," Sarah exclaimed. "Not exactly," Tabitha corrected gently, "but similar. Native Americans taught the colonists about corn." Grady poured himself coffee, watching as Tabitha guided Sarah's small hands in mixing batter. The kitchen felt different, warmer somehow, as if the light reached corners that had been shadowed for months. "There's coffee in the pot," Tabitha told him, "and the Jonah cakes are almost ready." When they sat down to eat, Sarah again bowed her head. This time, Grady remained silent, allowing her to whisper her childish gratitude. He caught Tabitha watching him, her expression not triumphant but quietly appreciative. Over the next few days, a subtle shift occurred in the household. Tabitha began helping with meals and taught the children simple chores they could manage independently. In the evenings, she conducted informal lessons at the kitchen table, inviting Grady to join them. At first, he refused, busying himself with ranch accounts. But gradually, he found himself lingering nearby, listening as she brought history and literature alive through stories. One evening, she read from a book of poetry, her voice giving rhythm and meaning to words that would have seemed impenetrable on the page. Grady found himself pausing in his work, caught by the rise and fall of her voice and the animated expressions of his children. What happened next in the story, Pa? Sarah asked at breakfast a few days later. Grady looked up, confused. What story? The one Miss Allen was reading last night. About the knight and the dragon. I don't know. I wasn't really listening. Yes, you were, Jonah said matter-of-factly. You stopped writing in your book and stared at Miss Allen for ages. Tabitha suppressed a smile as Grady's neck reddened. I was thinking about cattle prices, he muttered. That afternoon, a messenger arrived from town. The roof repairs on Tabitha's cottage were complete, and she could return whenever convenient. Grady found himself oddly reluctant to deliver the news. When he finally told her that evening, after the children were asleep, he was surprised by his own suggestion. You could stay through the week. No sense disrupting the children's routine mid-week. Tabitha studied him thoughtfully. That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose further. It's not an imposition, he said, more gruffly than intended. The children. They've improved since you've been here. She smiled. They were always wonderful children, Grady. They just needed someone to see them through their grief. And I didn't, he acknowledged, the admission painful but necessary. You were drowning in your own, she said gently. It's hard to offer a hand when you're fighting to stay afloat yourself. Her understanding, free of judgment, loosened something that had been tightly wounded inside him since Elizabeth's death. I failed them, he said, the words barely audible. Failed her. Tabitha moved closer on the porch bench. How? By grieving? By being human? By not protecting her? Not saving her or our son? Were you a doctor hiding your skills? Did you refuse to fetch help? No, but then you didn't fail her, Grady. Death comes for us all, sometimes cruelly early. Elizabeth's passing wasn't God's punishment or your failure. He stiffened at the mention of God. If he exists, he's a cruel master I want no part of. I questioned too. After Emmett and Clara, she admitted. I was so angry I couldn't pray for months. What changed? Time. And realizing that my anger was really just grief turned outward. Blame was easier than acceptance. She looked up at the stars. I don't have answers about why suffering exists. But I know that finding meaning afterward is our choice. They sat in companionable silence until the chill drove them inside. Sunday morning, Grady woke to find his children dressed in their best clothes, worn but clean. What's the occasion? He asked over breakfast. Sarah looked hesitantly at Tabitha before answering. Miss Allen said we could go to church with her if we wanted. Grady's jaw tightened. She had no right to suggest that without asking me. Actually, Tabitha interjected calmly, they asked me. I told them they needed your permission. He looked at his children's hopeful faces and felt cornered. Why do you want to go? Tommy Wilson says they sing real nice songs, Sarah offered. And there's a picnic after, Jonah added. With pie. Grady sighed, recognizing their hunger for community as much as sweets. You can go with Miss Allen. I'll collect you afterward. Won't you come too, Pa? Sarah pleaded. Mama would want you to. The mention of Elizabeth sent a familiar pain through him. Your mother isn't here to want anything. Sarah's face crumpled, and she ran from the room. Tabitha gave him a disappointed look before following. Jonah remained, studying his father with eyes too old for his 7 years. Ma used to say God was everywhere, watching over us. Is that not true anymore because she died? The simple question cut through Grady's defenses. He knelt before his son, struggling to find words. I don't know, Jonah. I wish I had answers for you. Miss Allen says it's okay to have questions. She says God doesn't mind. Grady touched his son's shoulder. Go get your sister. I'll hitch the wagon. You're coming? Jonah's face brightened. Just to the church door, Grady qualified. For now. He drove them to town in silence, helped them down at the whitewashed church, then turned to leave. The invitation stands, Grady, Tabitha said quietly. For the service or just the picnic after? He nodded but didn't commit. 3 o'clock. That would be fine. Grady spent the morning restlessly checking fences that didn't need checking. By noon, he found himself back in town, watching from a distance as the congregation spilled into the churchyard. He spotted his children playing with others their age, their laughter carrying across the open space. Tabitha stood with some of the town women, a basket over her arm, looking more at home than he'd seen her. He was about to ride away when Sarah spotted him. Pa, she called, running toward him with Jonah close behind. Trapped, Grady dismounted as they reached him. You missed the singing, Sarah informed him. But there's still pie. Before he could refuse, Tabitha approached, carrying a plate. "The children saved you some chicken," she said. "And Mrs. Wilson insisted you try her apple pie." Surrounded by his children's expectant faces, Grady found himself accepting the plate and following them to a blanket spread under a cottonwood tree. "Mr. Steele, good to see you," Preacher Jensen called as he passed. To Grady's relief, the man didn't stop, merely offering a friendly nod before continuing his rounds. As they ate, townspeople came by to greet them. Grady was surprised by the lack of prying questions or pointed remarks about his long absence. Instead, the conversation centered on cattle prices, the weather, a new shipment at the general store. "People have missed you," Tabitha observed quietly when they were momentarily alone. "They've been gossiping about the wild Steele children and their godless father." "You mean?" She smiled. "Actually, they've been telling me what a fine horseman you are, how you helped the Parkers rebuild after that windstorm, and how Elizabeth always spoke proudly of you." She touched his hand briefly. "You've been missed, Grady. Not judged." The picnic stretched into late afternoon. As families began packing up, Sheriff Parker approached them. "Got a favor to ask, Steele. My deputy's down with a broken leg, and I need to escort a prisoner to Cheyenne tomorrow. Town council's looking for volunteers to keep an eye on things for 3 days. You interested?" Grady's first instinct was to refuse, but he caught Tabitha watching him. What would it involve? Just making rounds, being visible. Doubt there'd be any real trouble. The sheriff lowered his voice. "Pays not much, but it would help me out considerably." "I'll do it," Grady found himself saying. "The ranch can manage for a few days." The sheriff looked genuinely relieved. "Much obliged. Stop by the office in the morning, and I'll show you the routine." That evening, as they drove home, the children chattered about their day. Sarah fell asleep against Tabitha's shoulder before they reached the ranch, and Grady carried her inside, struck by how light she felt in his arms. After the children were tucked in, Tabitha joined him on the porch again, bringing coffee. "Thank you for today," she said. It meant the world to them. "It wasn't terrible," he admitted. "Though I'm not sure what I've gotten myself into with the sheriff." "A step back into the community," she suggested. "It's good for you. For all of you." "You sound like Elizabeth," he said, then froze, surprised by his own words. Tabitha waited, giving him space to continue or retreat. "She was always pushing me to be more sociable," he elaborated finally. "Said a man needed neighbors as much as land." "She sounds very wise." She was. For the first time, he found he could speak of Elizabeth without that crushing weight on his chest. "Smart as a whip and stubborn as a mule. She's the one who insisted we homestead here instead of mining in Colorado like I wanted. Said she'd rather build something lasting than chase quick riches." "The children have her spirit," Tabitha observed. "Especially Sarah." "God help me when that girl gets older," he said, then realized he'd invoked God without bitterness for the first time in months. The significance wasn't lost on Tabitha, who smiled but didn't comment. Grady spent the next 3 days as acting deputy, making rounds of Hecla's modest business district and handling minor disputes. To his surprise, he found the work satisfying, purposeful in a way ranch work hadn't felt since Elizabeth's death. On his final afternoon as deputy, a commotion at the saloon drew his attention. Inside, he found a cowboy threatening the barkeep with a pistol, demanding free drinks. "That's enough," Grady said calmly, hand on his own weapon. "Put it down before someone gets hurt." The cowboy, young and clearly inexperienced with both liquor and firearms, wavered. "You ain't the real law. Real enough to lock you up until Sheriff Parker returns tomorrow," Grady replied evenly. "Your choice if you go quietly or with a headache." After a tense moment, the young man lowered his gun. Grady confiscated it, paid the barkeep for damages, and escorted the chastened cowboy to the jailhouse to sleep it off. Word of his handling of the situation spread quickly. By the time Grady collected his children from school, several townspeople had stopped him to express appreciation. "That was well done," Tabitha told him as they drove home. "Mrs. Wilson said you didn't even need to draw your weapon." "Kid was more foolish than dangerous," Grady said with a shrug, though he was pleased by her approval. That evening, as they ate supper, Sarah and Jonah automatically folded their hands and bowed their heads. To everyone's surprise, Grady did the same. "I'm grateful the young fool at the saloon had bad aim," he said gruffly. "And for this stew." Sarah's eyes widened in delight. I'm grateful Pa is saying grace with us. Jonah nodded solemnly. I'm grateful Miss Allen taught me about fractions today. Tabitha's voice was soft when she added, I'm grateful for this family and the privilege of knowing you all. Something in her tone made Grady look up. The word family hung in the air between them, carrying implications that should have frightened him but somehow didn't. Later, after the children were asleep, he found her packing her belongings. You're leaving? He asked, his chest tightening. My cottage is ready, she reminded him. And I've imposed long enough. It hasn't been an imposition, he said, moving closer. The children will miss you terribly. Just the children? She asked, meeting his eyes steadily. No, he admitted, his voice rough. Not just them. Tabitha set down the book she'd been packing. Grady, I don't want to complicate your life or rush you into something you're not ready for. I'm not ready, he agreed. But I'm also not the same man I was when you arrived. You've brought something back to this house to me that I thought was buried with Elizabeth. Hope, she suggested. That. And purpose beyond just surviving each day. He took her hand, calloused against her smoother one. I'm not asking for promises. Just don't go yet. She searched his face. What would Elizabeth think of this? The question didn't anger him as it might have weeks earlier. She'd tell me to stop being a stubborn fool and recognize a blessing when it's right in front of me. Tabitha laughed softly. I like her more with every story you tell. Stay, he said again. Please. We can figure out the rest as we go. All right, she agreed. But I'll need to retrieve some things from my cottage tomorrow. We'll all go, he decided. Make a day of it. The next morning, Sheriff Parker returned, looking tired but satisfied. Heard you handled things well, Steele. Particularly that incident at the saloon. Nothing serious, Grady demurred. Still, I appreciate it. Town council's talking about hiring a second deputy permanent if you're interested. Grady considered the offer. Part-time, maybe. I've still got a ranch to run. We'll work something out. The sheriff hesitated. There's talk of rebuilding the schoolhouse proper this summer. We'll need volunteers. Count me in, Grady said, surprising himself with his eagerness. As he left the sheriff's office, he spotted Tabitha outside the general store with his children, helping them select penny candy. Watching them together, he felt a lightness that had been absent for too long. That Sunday, Grady attended church with his family, for he had begun to think of them that way, the four of them together. He sat stiffly through the service, still uncomfortable but willing to be present for his children's sake. When Preacher Jensen mentioned God's healing grace, Grady found himself thinking not of his anger at Elizabeth's death, but of the unexpected gift of Tabitha's presence in their lives. Spring progressed into summer. Tabitha continued teaching, though she now rode to town with Grady each morning rather than from her cottage. The arrangement raised eyebrows at first, but as the townsfolk observed their careful propriety and the flourishing of the Steele children, acceptance followed. On a warm June evening, as fireflies began to blink across the pasture, Grady sat with Tabitha on the porch swing he'd built the previous weekend. I received a letter today, she said, her tone carefully neutral. The school board in Laramie has offered me a position for the fall term. Higher salary, more students. Grady's hands tightened on the swing's rope. Are you considering it? I should, she said quietly. Professionally, it's a significant opportunity. But, she turned to face him. But my heart is here now. With the children. With you. The relief that flooded him was so powerful, he had to close his eyes briefly. I've been meaning to talk to you about something, he said when he could trust his voice again. That sounds serious. It is. He took both her hands in his. Tabitha, I know it hasn't been very long, and there are probably proper ways to do this that I'm forgetting, but I'm asking if you'd consider becoming my wife. Her eyes widened, but she didn't pull away. Grady, are you certain? I would never want to replace Elizabeth. You couldn't, he said honestly, just as I could never replace Emmett. But maybe that's not what this is about. Maybe it's about building something new, something different, but equally valuable. She squeezed his hands. The children adore you, he finished. And I believe I do too. Her smile bloomed slowly. I believe I feel the same way. Is that a yes? It's a yes, she confirmed, with one condition. Name it. That we both acknowledge this for the blessing it is. That we don't let guilt about finding happiness after loss poison what we're building. In response, he leaned forward and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. Inside, Unnoticed by either of them, Sarah and Jonah watched from the window, their small faces alight with hope. They married in July, a simple ceremony in the church with the children as their attendants. Grady wore the suit he'd last worn at Elizabeth's funeral, now altered by Mrs. Wilson to fit his leaner frame. Tabitha carried wildflowers gathered by Sarah that morning. Preacher Jensen spoke of new beginnings and God's capacity to restore what seemed irrevocably lost. As he listened, Grady found himself not resisting the message but embracing it, his hand tight around Tabitha's. That evening, after a celebration at the ranch attended by half the town, they stood together watching the sunset while the children played with their new puppy, a wedding gift from Sheriff Parker. "Happy?" Tabitha asked, leaning against his shoulder. "More than I thought possible again," he admitted. "Though I feel I should apologize in advance." "For what?" "I'm still learning how to be a husband worth having," he said. "I'll make mistakes." "So will I," she assured him. "But we'll figure it out together." From the yard came Sarah's voice, calling them to see a frog she'd discovered. As they walked hand in hand toward the children, Grady felt something settle inside him, not the absence of grief, which would always have its place, but the presence of joy alongside it. That night at supper, it was Grady who led the grace, his deep voice steady as he gave thanks for the food, for their health, for the family gathered around the table. When he finished, he caught Tabitha's gaze across the table, the love in her eyes reflecting his own. Hecla watched the seasons turn, and the Steele Ranch flourished along with its family. Grady continued his part-time deputy work while expanding his cattle operation. Tabitha taught school and started a small library in a corner of the new schoolhouse he helped build. The following spring, they welcomed a daughter they named Hope, with Sarah and Jonah proudly assisting in her care. On Hope's first birthday, as they celebrated with a picnic by the creek that ran through their property, Grady watched his family, Tabitha supervising as Sarah helped Hope toddle across the grass, Jonah demonstrating his prowess at skipping stones, and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. "Penny for your thoughts," Tabitha said, sitting beside him on the blanket. "Just thinking about Grace," he replied, pulling her close. "Not just the prayer kind." "Oh," she prompted. "The kind that gives second chances. That brings a schoolteacher to a broken home and helps a man remember how to live instead of just survive." He kissed her temple. "The kind I'm grateful for every day." "As am I," she whispered. "As am I." When they gathered for supper that evening, all five Steeles joined hands around the table. Before he spoke the grace he now offered without hesitation, Grady looked at each beloved face, his children, his wife, his baby daughter, and knew with certainty that while faith couldn't erase loss, it provided the strength to build something beautiful from its ashes. "For this food, this family, and this life we share," he said, his voice strong and clear, "we give our thanks." "Amen. Amen," they echoed, the simple word a testament to the healing journey that had brought them to this moment, a family forged by love that was powerful enough to overcome grief, stubborn enough to persevere through doubt, and gracious enough to welcome joy when it arrived in unexpected ways.